Okay everyone, my name's Chris Hocking. This is my first time to one of these events, so this is very exciting. I'm not really an app developer. I mean, I develop apps, but I'm actually a filmmaker. So today I'm going to talk about how I got from sort of filmmaking to open source apps, and the last couple of weeks I've started releasing some apps on the Mac App Store. So yeah, this is a whole new world to me, and I'm learning all the pain and the good things about the Mac App Store. So my day job is I am a co-owner of a film and TV production company called Late Night Films. We do all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. So I have a very technical background. I started off in like concert lighting, then I went into like live event sort of stuff. I did animatronics for a BBC kids show. But I always loved computers and editing, that sort of thing, and filmmaking. So after university, I actually did concert lighting and animatronics for a few years, and then sort of quit and went and decided to study film for 3 years. And since then, I've sort of been, in the world of film and TV. But I always love sort of tinkering with stuff on the side. So this is just like an example of projects we make. So we've sort of done 2D animations, TV shows. We sort of make most of our money from advertising and corporate stuff. But what we want to do is make money off the creative projects. So we're constantly trying to get our own film and TV projects sort of up. My first sort of foray into app development was basically, I can't even remember, it must be like 5 years ago, on a Facebook group. I use Final Cut Pro, Apple's Final Cut Pro for all editing stuff. And someone just asked a question one day, like they had in Final Cut, if you've got like lots of clips, it's really hard to know where the playhead is. So even on this screen, you can sort of see if you lose track of where the actual playhead is. So I just made a very simple thing that highlights it when you press a shortcut key, makes it red. And then once I worked out how to do that, lots of people asked for millions of things. So over the course of the last 5 years, I've sort of just been adding stuff to CommandPost, and it's grown into this beast that I no longer control. It's all powered by Hammerspoon. I don't know if anyone knows Hammerspoon. Hammerspoon's a free and open source app. It basically is like a Lua scripting engine for macOS. So it's an Objective-C app, but you write Lua scripts to control anything and automate anything in macOS. And as a kid, I played around with BASIC and stuff, so I sort of loved Lua because it's so simple. I could do stuff so quickly. And so I basically just forked Hammerspoon, did a find and replace, and replaced Hammerspoon with CommandPost, and all the scripts and everything are all written in Lua. And yeah, it's had like 153,000 downloads across all the versions. I don't know. I don't really do any analytics or anything, so I'm not sure how many active users we sort of have. But yeah, it's just a pretty insanely powerful app, and a lot of the stuff we do is around control surfaces. So we have like support for Stream Deck's native support for Stream Decks. I think we're the only app to support Blackmagic makes like a speed editor and an editor's keyboard. So basically all this sort of stuff I do in, all the lower level stuff I do in Objective-C, and then all the actual all the main app code is all just done in Lua as a bunch of huge amount of scripts. But what I love about Lua is that I can literally like make one little change, click save in the text editor, and automatically reloads. And all this interface stuff, it's just all HTML. So it's really easy sort of update and that sort of thing. And then more recently, I've sort of jumped into the world of making proper Mac apps. So I've released 2 apps recently in the last couple of weeks, one called BRAW Toolbox and one called Gyroflow Toolbox. And BRAW Toolbox basically allows you to bring Blackmagic raw footage into Final Cut. So for whatever political weird reason, Apple and Blackmagic have never allowed BRAW to come into Final Cut. I think because there's no sort of open public API to bring in codecs, and since we moved from QuickTime to AV Foundations, in AV Foundations there's no sort of codec support anymore, so you can't easily just add new codecs. But there's so many filmmakers that shoot with Blackmagic cameras and they want to shoot with BRAW stuff, and currently the only way to do it is you convert all your footage to ProRes or something like that. But then if, like for example, for us, if a client gives us 4 terabytes of video footage, and we want to use Final Cut to edit with, then we need to transcode it all to ProRes, which takes half a day and another 4 terabytes of stuff. So I basically wanted a solution that will sort of make it easier so that as an editor, I can just plug in a drive and sort of make it all happen. And then Gyroflow Toolbox was sort of something that just came out of doing this. There's a free and open source app called Gyroflow, which basically cameras and even like iPhones have the gyroscopes in them. And Gyroflow basically allows you to read that metadata and help you stabilize footage. So if you've got a really sort of shaky camera, you can use the gyroscope data to stabilize the footage. And as I was doing the BRAW stuff, one of the cool things about the newer Blackmagic cameras is they've got gyroscopes in there. And so a lot of people are like, wow, you can import stuff, but we really want to stabilize as well. And I'm not really good at maths, and the stabilization maths is insanely complicated. But I found this free open source project called Gyroflow, and I basically just made a plugin for it. And the main developer from that project was super, super helpful. And there was lots of stuff I needed to solve because it was GPL. So I needed to talk to some other libraries that he was using and sort of try convince them to change to MIT so I could use it, and then add like a clause in the GPL to allow App Store usage as well. So it was a lot of like licensing, sort of just sweet talking people to try and make it all sort of work. But we eventually got there. So yeah, today I will mainly talk about this BRAW Toolbox and a little bit about Gyroflow. And again, I'd done stuff, like I knew enough Objective-C to be dangerous, but I'd never really done any crazy deep diving stuff, just a lot of Stack Overflow, copy and paste and modify stuff, and now ChatGPT helped me out a lot. But this was my sort of first proper app that I really wanted to put on the App Store, just because it gave... One of the issues I had with CommandPost originally was because I originally called it FCP hacks because I was doing a whole lot of hacky stuff, and people got very nervous and were too scared to install on their computer because they thought I'd do something dodgy or that sort of thing. So I feel like the App Store gave it some sort of natural credibility. And I had to... It's quite a complicated problem because Final Cut, even though it's on the Mac App Store, it's not actually sandboxed. Apple sort of ignored their own rules for that. And I sort of needed to work out a way to handle all that sort of sandboxing stuff. And I really, because there's no like decoder API, I basically had to come up with clever ways to make this all work. So the two APIs that I had access to were an API called Workflow Extensions, which allows you to add sort of like extensions to Final Cut, and their effects engine. So I basically made a workflow extension. So in Final Cut, these are a bunch of third-party workflow extensions, and the workflow extension sort of became my interface. And people on the Slack probably like a couple of months ago, I asked, how would I design an interface like this? Because I'd never really used Interface Builder. All Final Cut's still in Objective-C, and all the API documentation is really geared towards, and all the examples is geared towards Objective-C. So Swift wasn't really an option, and I didn't really know enough. And so yeah, I basically had to learn Interface Builder, hook this all together. And it was sort of hard to debug because it's not really, because it's an extension. It's not like I'm sure there's ways to do it, but it was harder to debug because you don't get that instant Xcode sort of information. It doesn't seem to flow across nicely. So it was a bit harder to all sort of make work. But basically, I can bring in some BRAW footage. So I've just got a bunch of files here. And this is just a metal view, and I'm using Blackmagic's SDK. So I basically just read the file. When I import those files, obviously that solves the sandboxing issue for this part. And then I get full access to all the metadata controls, and you can do playback and everything. So this is sort of like the interface for bringing stuff into Final Cut Pro. And then to get around, so I basically had access to this interface, which is cool. I can build something that looks cool in Final Cut. But because there's no a way to bring in footage, I basically tricked it into using like their effects engine to bring in this BRAW footage. So what I do is when we click the prepare BRAW files, what it's doing is basically just ripping out the audio because the effects engine only deals with video. And then it's a bit of a weird interface because now I just need to drag and drop this green icon. It turns into a Final Cut event icon, library icon. I can drag this into here. And this basically uses like a pasteboard promise to bring across a Final Cut Pro XML data, which brings across all the clips. So now in here, I have full access to all that footage. And like, I was pretty surprised how sort of performant it is. This is all like, what's this? Oh, it's only 2K. What's this? Yeah, this is a 12K sort of clip. And if I change the decode quality, but I can get better performance. But basically now I can do something that's never been done in Final Cut before. I can bring in this raw footage without having to transcode it, without having to create massive intermediate projects. And I get sort of full metadata control. So if I just grab a bunch of these clips, I'll just throw them in a timeline. So basically, I've got things that, I know this isn't an editing talk, it's a coding talk, but to sort of explain how it works, I basically created like special sorts of clips, and when I click into them, I've got this sort of like a dummy clip that allows me to apply my effect there. And then within here, I get full metadata control. So I can keyframe exposure and I can change all the settings within here, which is something like even in Blackmagic's own software, you can't sort of keyframe exposure and that sort of thing. So I have sort of full control over doing that. And the way that all sort of works is behind the scenes, when I drag that file across, it basically, I'm using document scope security mark bookmarks to hold to sort of link between these two frameworks, because they're essentially two separate extensions. And then you can also do cool things like if I've got some global settings, I can sort of force different quality settings which apply to all the clips, which isn't something that you can normally do in Final Cut. And I can also just grant Sandbot access to like the effects engine, so that if I'm collaborating with like another editor overseas, as long as the file paths are the same, everything will just magically work, and I don't have to worry about the document scope, security scope bookmarks, because I can just grant the effects engine sort of full access. And then, so as part of that, I also did this Gyroflow thing, and basically it just allows you to bring in Gyroflow projects. So you still need the third-party open source app to sort of do the stabilization, and you essentially just bring in a file. And this is like a crazy example. If I just turn off this, you can see this footage is just from their demo site, and they've just gone crazy with just moving the camera an insane amount just to demonstrate. And then if I turn on this stabilization, and this is sort of zoomed out so you can sort of see the effect of it, you can see sort of the crazy amount of, it's taking all that gyroscope metadata and sort of really stabilizing that footage. How long do I have to talk to? I'm used to doing like film and TV lectures, or like teaching at universities where there's a lot more sort of students asking questions. I could go a bit more off tangent on different things. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to, however we do the question thing. But yeah, and again with this, I also had to think about like do all that, the bookmarking thing. And for this, basically I import in the BRAW project and save it within like the Final Cut effects, so that if you take this project to another computer, it just sort of stays with it and you don't have to worry about sort of relinking files and that sort of thing. In terms of like things I learnt, today I learnt like a really tricky or annoying thing. I pushed out like my first update. I was very nervous about pushing out an update, because with CommandPost, if I break something, it only takes me 5 minutes to push out a new update and everything's better. This morning we did tests in the office. We had it going on a few machines. Everything was great. I pressed go live in App Connect, and then like one of my editors in the office went, "Oh, why is this so blurry?" We were like, "What?" And I changed something somewhere, and it's only in certain circumstances. I think if you zoomed in the thing. So then I was like, "Oh," quickly problem solved, and I pushed out another app, and now I'm just waiting for Apple to please release the update before all the Americans wake up and start sending me angry emails. But I was so lucky that, having never like done anything with the app, so I didn't really understand how it all worked, that sort of thing. I was very fortunate that it got into like the top 1 and 2 on the Mac App Store for photo and video, which was a really cool screenshot to get because it was above Final Cut, Apple's own product. So that would definitely go on some kind of CV somewhere. But yeah, it's been a really interesting process because like things that you don't really know coming into it in terms of like, I had no idea how much paperwork you guys all do in terms of just the accounting side to get things on the App Store. All the technical things about, like I just assumed that you could get notifications every time someone bought an app off you and you could just sort of go, oh yes, I have a new user, $5 richer or whatever. But having that I think App Store Connect on my thing at the moment is like 5 days behind for some reason, just because it is. And it's also 5 days behind in like UTC time. So it's sort of, I have no idea how the time zones work and what point is actually the real world time. But if I jump over to Xcode, so yeah, it was a big learning experience, and even things like, because the Blackmagic raw SDK is all in C++, I'd never done any C++, so I had to sort of, I basically, found that little Duvawaki over here and went, oh, Objective-C++, that'll solve some problems. So yeah, you can see here I've tried to be, I'm not a programmer, so I've tried to be sort of as organized as possible and sharing code between. So I've basically got like some shared code, a wrapper application, which is like the main application that holds the two extensions, and then we've got the FxPlug, which is the render engine, the workflow extension, which is the user interface. And then, yeah, so things like, for example, with Blackmagic files, one of the cool things about it is that you can have a sidecar file, which contains additional metadata, so you can sort of adjust metadata without having to modify your video file. So I had to work out all that kind of stuff with the, what is it called? Whatever this, file presenter sort of API is, so that in the sandbox environment, I can get access to that sidecar file. And if anyone knows how to do more than one extra file at a time, that'd be handy to know, because I haven't worked out how to, I've tried to use like 2 file coordinators, but it doesn't sort of work. I think that's pretty much, unless anyone has any questions. Obviously, I learnt a whole heap about how to make it all sort of happen. And there's a lot of tricky things because the FxPlug for API isn't really particularly well documented. And whilst I found it really easy to get technical support from Blackmagic because they're based in Melbourne, with Apple, it's sort of, sometimes I get like a really fast reply, but it's not necessarily a super helpful technical reply. Whereas Blackmagic, I send them an email and then I get like an actual engineer that sends me stuff that I have to Google like what half the words are to actually understand it. So it's been interesting, the differences between the local Blackmagic company and the big Apple, that they're very careful. I never get really personalized emails from the people at Apple. They're very crisp to 3 dot points. But there's lots of tricks because, for example, with even this extension here, these buttons, because I need to sort of trigger an open file thing. So it basically, these buttons are actually in my own view that I own, and pass that through to Final Cut Pro, so that when I click that button, the view actually has this, like, the ownership of the app, so that the security bookmarks sort of work and that sort of thing. So all the UI buttons, even though there's like a simple API for like add button, I sort of had to work out how to do custom views to make that work, because if I use Final Cut's buttons, then the document scope, security scope bookmarks don't work because it doesn't have ownership and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's pretty much what I've been doing. And I'm hoping that Apple will approve my test flight build and my app update, so that I don't get a whole lot of angry people email me in the morning. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, yeah.
So well done on the app. I was just more so curious on how the app itself, does it install extensions to the motion templates?
So yes, so basically if we open up the app itself, So this is sort of the main wrapper application. So when you first install it, I need to install motion templates. So when you click that, it asks for permission to install that. And then metadata views also get stored in the application, user application support, so I need permission for that, and LUTs as well. And the LUTs are just used for, again, this is video talk, not necessarily coding talk, but for HDR, high dynamic range images, Final Cut does some funky stuff. So I had to work with some color scientists to make it all flow nicely between Final Cut and thing. So basically, the main wrapper app just uses, 2 extensions that get triggered as soon as you open this main wrapper app. Then whatever the macOS extensions API just auto magically detects those 2 things and just auto installs them.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Not so much a question, but a comment. Your icons are stunning.
Yes. Matthew, I didn't make them. I'm not that talented. But yeah, a New Zealand guy, Matthew, and I forget his last name. I'm not on the internet. But yes, if we have a look at these things. So basically, he's been amazing. So this was the first one I did with him, and we tried to be very sort of, I didn't really give him that much feedback. It was like, just make it look really cool, really real, add more scratches. Once you think you've got it looking cool, like pretend to drop it a few times. And that's what he came up with, which was so cool. And then he did this one, which blew my mind because the camera looks incredible. And I think he does it all in Sketch and then sort of brings into Photoshop to sort of do some touch-ups. And then, this was the most recent one that he did, which again, just like all the subtle detail. And so yes, I literally use it as my desktop backdrop now because it sort of, I just want to make more apps just so that I can pay him money to build more icons because they're really cool.
Nice.
Sorry, this is amazing. But you say you don't really know how to code or Wikify and all of that, but how did you learn all that? This is amazing. So what is your main source of learning? Tutorials or anything else? Somebody else? I want to know.
I guess I've always had a good brain for doing it, but like literally like Visual Basics, Q Basic, DOS Basic sort of knowledge of it. And that's what I loved about CommandPost. So if we ever look at, I'll just show you like the insides of CommandPost. So CommandPost is literally just Hammerspoon. And if we show this in Finder, within thing we have extensions, which are basically all a bunch of extensions, which can be Objective-C or Lua, but they're all sort of got a Lua wrapper. So there's like a bunch of, so we basically built out an API to control Final Cut because Final Cut doesn't natively support any control surfaces. So we basically use like the accessibility API to control everything. So we basically use every trick in the book. We watch the preferences file, we use accessibility watches to watch where all the UI things, and it gives us sort of full control over Final Cut. So we sort of built out an API to do that, and it's just a whole lot of like pretty basic Lua sort of stuff. But yeah, there is like literally, if I open so I just use BB Edit for all the Lua stuff. And the like a couple of days ago, I opened it, and do I have CommandPost? Oh yeah, there we are. And it was like, I think it instantly like used like 30 gigs because I had so many untitled things open, and so many like literally I'd like open up video files in the text editor to work out how things are working or whatever. So yeah, I was using up 30 gigs of RAM in a text editor. But so yeah, it's based like made up of lots of extensions and plugins. So basically each feature in CommandPost. So if we ever look at like the preferences, for example, this is sort of its own plugin. So there's like a whole lot of Lua plugins that do specific things. So I can sort of disable or open any of these plugins in an editor, and that's really cool because I can just experiment and just play around and do stuff. So Lua, like CommandPost, is sort of my playground to just pretend to be a programmer and sort of solve any problem really quickly because I had access to these tools. I didn't need to do any deep stuff like that. It's not necessarily that hard, that easy to crash it because it's all sort of protected. So yeah, Lua is where I did it. And by doing that, for example, with all the control surface support in this, with like Stream Deck and stuff like that, I had to learn some Objective-C to do the deeper stuff. And I guess that's what I love about coding and programming, is it's just problem solving. For example, with the, there's a bunch of Razer make like these crazy keypad gaming sort of devices. And they dropped macOS support at some point in the last few years because, I don't know, they just want to focus on Windows or stuff like that. And so there's no drivers or anything for this. But to do this, I basically just use a command line tool to sort of pretend to basically disable all the buttons, and then use some Objective-C to watch all those buttons, and then it triggers stuff in Lua, and then I can make it do anything and control all the lights and that sort of thing. So I basically learned all the Objective-C stuff just to solve little technical things, and then did all the sort of really logic stuff in Lua. And yeah, that gave me enough knowledge now to smash something out in thing. But yeah, there's lots of, like, I don't have any formal like computer science training. So for like something like this BRAW thing, like one of the issues with the first version I put out is it was using like hundreds and thousands of threads. And I was like, I have no idea why that's bad or why it's doing that. So all those sort of like basic computer things about how threads work and multi-threading and that sort of thing, I don't really understand. I just sort of know enough to sort of smash the keyboard until I can make it work and people stop complaining.
Yeah. Please don't say you're not a programmer. You are one of the most amazing programmers I've ever witnessed. So
thank you.
Please.
Thank you.
Any other questions anybody have? Oh yeah, down the back. Make this one the last one.
So from a part-time editor, use Final Cut Pro. The one thing I stopped doing early is not using HDR video because I found the built-in one was always crap.
Yeah.
Is yours better?
Well, so basically, I'll just quickly show you. So one of the issues we had with HDR, so if I just bring in, so this is going a bit not on the coding side, but with HDR, basically, with BRAW files, you define like a color space gamut and a gamma space. So if I change this, I'll use like DaVinci wide gamut. So that's what DaVinci Blackmagic sort of makes, is this sort of wide gamut. And then I'm going to change the gamma to DaVinci Intermediate, which is their own sort of gamma space for HDR sort of stuff. And then, actually, I probably need to make HDR project. But we basically built in different color spaces to match whatever you've got in Final Cut. So for example, if I want to do Rex 2020 PQ, when I change this, if I've got the right gamut and gamma settings, then it looks right in this workflow extension. And then if I just very quickly make a new library in Final Cut, just save it to the desktop, save here anyway. And I will make this HDR. So in Final Cut, you can basically have like standard, which is like standard dynamic range libraries, and then high dynamic range libraries, which gives you sort of like more control between the lights and the darks. So I'm just going to change that. And then basically to trick Final Cut into doing all the right things, so I'll bring one of these clips in again. So I'll change that back. So that's that. I'm going to change it to DaVinci wide gamut and DaVinci intermediate, and then you can see in here, I mean, it's probably hard to see on the projector, but now this image looks right on my laptop. It looks a bit funky on this one. And then we basically added the reason that you install LUTs, and LUTs are like, they're called lookup tables. They basically change the color of things. We basically added this automation where when we click this, you don't see any change in here, but then when I bring these files into Final Cut, oops, sorry, wrong one. It basically applies, if I jump into this effect, we apply our normal BRAW Toolbox effect, and then we basically add a LUT here, and you can sort of see the difference here to convert it into what makes it look right to match professional color grading software like DaVinci Resolve. So using this, if you're using Blackmagic stuff in HDR and you're using this stuff with these settings, it all just magically works, and what you see in Final Cut will match what you see in DaVinci Resolve. And I work with a bunch of really smart color people that have like grading monitors that are like $200,000 on their desk to make sure like they're not judging it based on what they look on a computer screen. They're looking at very expensive monitors and going, yes, that pixel is exactly the right shade of red. So yeah, that's how we sort of solve that. So yes, Final Cut's a bit funky because it doesn't have a lot of control. You've just got that standard dynamic range and wide dynamic range, and that's sort of it. Whereas in something like DaVinci Resolve, there's 7 billion settings, and you sort of need to be a scientist to know how everything works. But this, with like magic stuff, sort of makes that easier because it automatically applies the right conversion that matches DaVinci Resolve and other sort of apps. Does that sort of answer the question? Sweet.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you.